Before the sun had even touched the horizon, the silence of northern Burkina Faso was shattered. In a remote military base at Dargo, more than 50 young soldiers, sons, brothers, fathers, were struck down in one of the bloodiest ambushes this year. Their sacrifice was not just a local tragedy. It was a spark, a cry, a drumbeat echoing across the continent. For President Ibrahim Traore, this was not a moment of retreat. Standing at the funeral, tears in his eyes but fire in his voice, he declared what our ancestors once declared in chains: enough is enough. His words carried the same spirit that filled the streets of Selma, that rang from the steps of Washington when Dr. King spoke. Just as no bullet could silence the dream of freedom in America, no ambush will silence the dream of dignity in Africa. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point. People long underestimated, long exploited are rising. And what happens in Burkina Faso today will be remembered by every African child tomorrow. Stay with us. Do not just witness history, be part of it. Subscribe now and stand with those who refuse to kneel. In the northern reaches of Burkina Faso, where the land is dry and the wind carries both dust and prayer, lies the town of Dargo in Bulza province. For years it had been a frontier post, a fragile shield against the tide of militant violence sweeping across the Sahel. But in late July of this year, before dawn had broken, that shield was pierced. Around 100 heavily armed fighters stormed the military base at Dargo. They came not as shadows, but as a flood, attacking from multiple directions in what strategists call a swarm assault. Within minutes, the base's communications were cut. Surveillance drones, usually the watchful eyes in the sky, were mysteriously disabled. Soldiers, many barely in their 20s, fought bravely but were overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the attack. By the time the gunfire faded, more than 50 Burkinabe soldiers lay dead. Their bodies were burned alongside their outpost, their weapons looted. Their sacrifice meant to send a chilling message. But instead of silence, whispers grew louder. The attackers were believed to be part of Jainim, an Al-Qaeda affiliate active across Mali and Burkina Faso. Yet the timing of the assault, so close to the American delegation's visit, just days after Ibrahim Traore had refused the Washington honor, many suspected, was a diplomatic trap, sparked questions no one could ignore. Was this a simple act of terrorism? Or was it a warning engineered to punish a nation that dared to say no to foreign masters? In the capital, the reaction was immediate. Posters of the 50 fallen were plastered across public buildings. Schools closed in mourning. The flag was lowered across Ouagadougou. For 3 days, markets grew quiet. Churches and mosques overflowed with prayers, and elders sat in silence, remembering not only the dead, but every generation of Africans taken too soon. One widow, holding her child, told a local reporter, "They thought they buried soldiers, but what they planted will rise as a forest of resistance." On the day of the funeral, Traore walked not as a distant president, but as a soldier among soldiers. He carried the casket of one of the young men himself, his face carved by grief, yet unshaken by fear. Standing before the nation, his words were brief but thunderous. "This land is not for sale. Their blood is not in vain. Never again will Burkina Faso kneel." For older African Americans watching from afar, these images echo memories of Montgomery, of Selma, of the long march for dignity in their own homeland. When men in uniform fell, when leaders were cut down, the community did not collapse. It rose stronger. And here, in Burkina Faso, history was repeating, though the soil was African red and the voices spoke in Moori and French. The rhythm, however, was the same. Sorrow turned into strength. International media quickly picked up the story. Western outlets framed it as yet another episode of Sahel instability. But inside the country, no one called it instability. They called it sacrifice. They called it betrayal. They called it the moment when Burkina Faso, bruised but unbroken, would chart its own destiny. Yet in every cafe and courtyard, the same question lingered. How would Traore respond? Would he lean on old alliances, beg for outside intervention, or bow to the pressure of global powers? Or would he carve a new path, one that no African leader before him had dared to tread? The answers would come soon, and they would shock the world. The funeral ended, but the silence of mourning did not last. From the heart of Ouagadougou came a voice that turned grief into resolve. Ibrahim Traore, standing before the nation, declared in words both simple and unbreakable, "Burkina Faso will never bow." For many outside the continent, this may have sounded like rhetoric. But for the people of Burkina Faso and for Africans everywhere, these words were not empty. They were a vow, sealed in the blood of 50 fallen soldiers. And unlike leaders of the past who bent beneath the weight of foreign pressure, Traore chose a different path. He did not ask for pity. He did not beg for weapons. He chose to act. Within days, an abandoned repair facility in Ouagadougou roared back to life. Once a forgotten industrial block, it was transformed into a covert weapons laboratory. Behind its guarded gates, Burkinabe engineers and university graduates worked day and night, assembling the country's first indigenously built drone missiles. Not imported, not donated, built with Burkinabe hands, Burkinabe minds, Burkinabe pride. For the first time in history, the small nation in the Sahel was no longer just a battlefield. It was becoming an arsenal. And Traore was not alone. Just 48 hours after the attack at Dargo, Russian special forces touched down at Ouagadougou airport. They were not mercenaries chasing contracts, but instructors operating on Traore's terms. Together with local troops, they launched intensive joint drills, border defense, drone warfare simulations, and anti-terror operations. In dusty fields outside Kaya, Russian trainers watched as young Burkinabe recruits maneuvered with determination. The sound of their boots echoed like war drums, steady and unyielding. This was more than military preparation. It was a psychological transformation. The loss of 50 soldiers had not weakened the nation, it had ignited it. Enlistments surged across the country. From the plains of Fada Ngurma to the markets of Bobo Dioulasso, young men and women volunteered. Mothers brought their sons to recruitment centers, whispering blessings of protection. Farmers offered their land for training grounds. Communities shared food and tools with the military. To older African Americans watching, the images were deeply familiar. They recalled the Freedom Summer of 1964, when ordinary citizens, teachers, preachers, students rose up not with guns but with courage to demand dignity. In the streets of Burkina Faso, the spirit was the same. Ordinary people, once silent, now moved with unity, not for protest but for defense. Traore gave this mobilization a name, Operation Kulpilgo. Its aim was not only to build an army, but to prepare an entire people. Civilian defense classes began in schools. Artificial intelligence sensors were installed on vulnerable borders. Anti-drone systems were developed with local innovation. It was not just soldiers being trained, it was bakers, blacksmiths, teachers, and students. Every citizen, in mind and in body, was to become a guardian. Perhaps the most dramatic gesture came with the stroke of a pen. Traore redirected $300 million, once earmarked for international aid projects, into domestic military innovation. No longer would Burkina Faso wait for foreign donors to decide its future. The nation was declaring itself self-reliant, whatever the cost. Across the land, the response was not despair, but determination. In the hills of Kaya, villagers sang war songs as they trained. In Fora, traditional hunters passed down knowledge of terrain and tracking to young recruits. In classrooms, children drew pictures of the drones carrying the national flag. One teacher told the local press, "Our children will not only learn arithmetic, they will learn freedom." The momentum was undeniable. The world expected a broken nation. Instead, it saw a people united in defiance. The pain of Dargo was still fresh, but it had been transformed into something greater. The funeral had birthed the movement, and the attack that was meant to weaken Burkina Faso had instead lit a fire across the Sahel. But as drums of resistance grew louder, questions emerged. How would the international community react? Would allies stand firm, or would enemies strike harder? And could a small nation in West Africa truly carry the weight of defying global powers? The answer lay not only in weapons and soldiers, but in the heart of the people themselves. And that heart was about to be tested in ways no one expected. The attack at Dargo was meant to bring Burkina Faso to its knees. Instead, it brought the entire nation to its feet. Across Ouagadougou, the capital, life slowed as the country entered a period of mourning. Schools closed their doors, markets stood silent, and families gathered in prayer. For 3 days, the nation grieved as one. Portraits of the fallen 50 were displayed on walls and lampposts. Their faces, young, determined, unfinished, became symbols etched into the public memory. Mothers wept in courtyards. Children clutched photographs of fathers they would never see again. But grief alone did not define the days that followed. Out of sorrow rose something stronger, unity. On the 4th day, as the nation prepared for the mass funeral, tens of thousands gathered in the capital. Flags were lowered, drums beat slow rhythms of mourning, and choirs sang hymns that blended the Christian psalms, Islamic prayers, and traditional chants of the ancestors. The country was not only burying soldiers, it was declaring its refusal to surrender. Standing among the people, President Ibrahim Traore launched what would be called Operation Kulpilgo. The strategy was bold, unprecedented. Every citizen would play a role in national defense. Military training centers opened not only in barracks, but in schools and town halls. Villagers were taught to recognize drones in the sky, to monitor borders, and to report suspicious movements. Artificial intelligence sensors were installed in remote areas, watching over roads and farmlands. It was as if the entire nation had become a living fortress. $300 million, once reserved for international aid projects, were redirected into this initiative. It was a decision that shocked the world. How could a poor nation choose guns over food? But for the Burkinabe, the answer was simple. Without survival, there is no development. We cannot plant crops if foreign boots trample our soil, a farmer told local radio. We cannot build schools if our children are killed before they learn to write. In towns across the country, ordinary people stepped into extraordinary roles. Blacksmiths began forging blades not for ceremony, but for defense. Hunters offered their centuries-old knowledge of terrain and trekking. Young women joined first aid brigades, while elders hosted community councils to prepare strategies. Musicians composed ballads from the cries of widows, their songs becoming daily anthems on local radios. Painters filled the city walls with murals. Soldiers, villagers, children holding rifles carved from wood, all painted beneath one phrase, "Never again." Perhaps the most moving sight came from the schools. In villages and cities alike, children planted what they called freedom trees, one for each of the 50 soldiers who had died. Teachers explained, their blood waters the soil. These trees will grow into the future they dreamed of. For older African Americans watching, the image was deeply familiar. It echoed the freedom schools of the 1960s, where children learned not just to read and write, but to dream of justice. Religious leaders, too, stepped forward. For the first time in decades, Muslim clerics, Christian pastors, and traditional priests stood together on one stage, declaring a united national day of prayer. They spoke not of division, but of a single destiny, a nation under God's protection, shielded by the ancestors, guided by courage. Their voices were not the voices of fear, they were the voices of faith. Politically, the consequences were profound. Traore's government gained a surge of legitimacy. Far from being seen as a regime of military men, it was embraced as the voice of the people. Opposition movements that once questioned his rule found little ground to stand on. The death of 50 soldiers had, paradoxically, strengthened the resolve of millions. Burkina Faso was no longer just a small country in the Sahel, it was becoming a symbol of African dignity. International analysts wondered, was this sustainable, or was it the desperation of a cornered nation? But inside the borders, the answer was clear. Every drumbeat, every planted tree, every whispered prayer spoke the same truth. Burkina Faso would not be broken. And yet, as unity grew at home, the storm beyond its borders gathered strength. Powerful nations watched closely, some with admiration, many with unease. They asked, if one of Africa's smallest nations could rise from such loss, what would stop the rest of the continent from following? If you believe this is the rise Africa has waited for, lift your voice in the comments below. The question was no longer whether Burkina Faso could endure, but how the world would respond to a nation refusing to kneel. While Burkina Faso turned its grief into unity, the wider world began to shift uneasily. In Washington, think tanks scrambled to publish emergency reports. What had once been dismissed as a small coup leader was now a man who refused to kneel, a man turning his nation into a fortress. Western newspapers, which months earlier had described Ibrahim Traore as energetic and charismatic, now branded him radical, defiant, even dangerous. For many older African Americans, this shift felt hauntingly familiar. In the 1960s, when young men and women marched for civil rights, U.S., media often labeled them agitators and troublemakers. What the oppressed called justice, the powerful called disorder. And now, decades later, the same vocabulary was being used, not in Alabama, but in Ouagadougou. Behind closed doors, U.S. and European officials debated sanctions. Reports suggest that arms embargoes and restrictions on international aid were being drafted. Diplomats whispered of isolating Burkina Faso, while Western media amplified fears of the Sahel becoming a haven for extremism. Yet what they called extremism, the Burkinabe called survival. Russia, by contrast, wasted no time. Kremlin spokesman praised Traore's courage, calling him a new symbol of African liberation. Russian advisors expanded training missions not just for combat but for intelligence, cyber defense, and long-term strategy. State media celebrated Burkina Faso as proof that nations could resist Western dominance. China took a more cautious route. Its diplomats called for restraint and regional stability. But quietly, Beijing sent envoys to explore new opportunities in trade, mining, and infrastructure. For China, Burkina Faso was not just a partner in defiance, it was a potential partner in business. Closer to home, the silence of the African Union was deafening. Weeks passed without a single official statement condemning the attack or expressing solidarity. On social media, Burkina-based citizens erupted with anger. Hashtags like YAU Weru and Either Africa for Traore trended across the continent. The people demanded that their institutions speak, but the halls of Addis Ababa remained still. In contrast, Burkina Faso found firm ground with its neighbors. Alongside Mali and Niger, it formed what they called the Wall of Resistance. This was more than an alliance, it was a declaration. The three nations shared intelligence, rotated troops, and designed a joint security doctrine unlike anything seen before. They called it the African Doctrine of Retaliation. This doctrine had three pillars: total self-reliance, no foreign bases, no begging, build with what you have; strategic disruption, fight not only on battlefields but also in economics, cyberspace, and diplomacy; civic militarization, every citizen a sentinel, every village a stronghold. To some, this was visionary, to others reckless. But for those who remembered Africa's centuries of subjugation, it was long overdue. As Western analysts watched with unease and Russian planes continued to land in Ouagadougou, one question echoed louder than any other. Could a small landlocked nation, once ignored, truly alter the balance of global power? The answer would depend not only on weapons or alliances, but on the choices Africa was willing to make for itself. And those choices were fast approaching. The wall of resistance had been declared, the doctrine announced, and the spirit of a wounded nation transformed into resolve. Yet even as unity grew within, storms brewed without. What lay ahead for Burkina Faso and for Africa was not a single path but many, each with its own peril and promise. The first path was escalation. If external powers sought to punish Burkina Faso, the pressure could erupt into full-scale conflict. Sanctions, embargoes, or covert operations could tighten the noose, forcing the young nation into a siege. History is full of such attempts when empires tried to strangle small nations into submission. For older African Americans, the echo is unmistakable. It recalls the days when voices for justice in America were beaten, jailed, or silenced, all in the hope that the dream would die. But as Dr. King once said, truth crushed to earth will rise again. The second path was diplomatic warfare. Already, Burkina Faso's leaders were speaking of new currencies backed by gold, new alliances beyond the West. Economic sabotage was expected, but so too were new opportunities for independence. The question was whether Africa could stand together long enough to withstand the storm. The third path, the most daring, was true self-reliance. This meant more than weapons. It meant agriculture free from dependency, education rooted in African history, technology designed by African hands. It meant a continent no longer defined by the aid it received, but by the destiny it claimed. It was a bold vision, one that frightened global powers precisely because it promised permanence. For the elders watching from afar, this choice carried profound weight. Many of them remembered the civil rights marches, the nights in jail, the moments when hope seemed lost. They remembered how every victory was bought with suffering, and how every step forward was met with resistance. And they saw in Ibrahim Traore and the people of Burkina Faso the same spirit that carried them through Montgomery, Selma, and Washington. The faces were different, but the fire was the same. In villages across Burkina Faso, that fire burned in the eyes of children planting freedom trees, in the hands of mothers preparing meals for soldiers, in the voices of musicians turning pain into song. It burned in every whispered prayer, every lifted fist, every refusal to kneel. This was no longer only about 50 fallen soldiers. It was about a continent standing at the crossroads of history. And now, as the drums of war and the songs of freedom rise together, the question is no longer what Burkina Faso will do. The question is what Africa itself is willing to choose. Will the continent take the hard road of dignity or retreat into the old chains of dependency? The next step will decide not only Burkina Faso's fate, but the destiny of generations yet unborn.